NBR columnist Brigitte Morten worries that trust in our public institutions could be undermined. She joins me now. What specifically are you worried about in terms of public trust being eroded, if you like, in our public institutions?
Yeah, I think you want to be careful here that you're not sort of barking at every passing car. But I think the last week gave us a number of examples of where the government have taken action or is taking action that could put at risk the high trust that we do have in our public institutions.
What sort of examples are you referring to?
Well, I think one of the key ones was what happened in the House last week. Currently going through Parliament is the bill that will merge TVNZ and RNZ. And the Minister of Broadcasting, Willie Jackson, was really under pressure in the House in terms of, answering why this was necessary, etc. And what he came back to, and the only thing he could really lean on, was that saying that, there was really a lack of trust or a decline in trust in media. Now, this is kind of true, except for the fact that the two institutions that are getting merged here actually have some of the highest trusts in New Zealand. And second of all, there was no examples of it actually how merging them together would actually increase that trust. And some argue will actually decrease it because they're going to become somewhat of a powerhouse within the sort of competitive environment of media in New Zealand.
Well, it's going back to the powerhouse that they once were under the old New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation, isn't it?
Well, yes, it is. And I do probably just turn to you, generational gap here, Brent. You've probably got more experience than I do on this one. But I do say that might be true, but that doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do in terms of whether or not this is what we need to increase a trust in media. I would actually argue that some of the other things like the Public Broadcasting Fund, some of the information that's come out of Parliament, and also how the government's been treating media is actually probably leading to some of that distrust in media.
Is it more, though, in terms of politicians and, for instance, in Willie Jackson's case, not really putting the case that well? Because, in fact, the former broadcasting minister, Chris Farfoy, looked at it much more as an issue around how all of the media technologies were converging. So it didn't make sense for the government to have these separate public service media organisations that effectively would be doing similar things. If you look at RNZ, they've gone into video. TVNZ's obviously got a website and all of that. So, is it more a failing of the politicians rather than an issue of the institutions themselves?
Yeah, and I think absolutely you're right. And this points to actually what the problem is here and what my sort of, column's about is that it's not necessarily that we do have a problem with these institutions. It's actually what the government's doing or saying around them that actually undermines or maybe creates more distrust in them. So, Willie Jackson could have relied on exactly, the reasons that his predecessor used for why this was a necessary thing to do. But instead, he went to looking at and undermining exactly what those media organisations did.
So is the backdrop to this the COVID-19 pandemic, and that obviously in 2020, 2021 in particular, the government did, I guess, use extraordinary powers in terms of responding to that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element of that. The OECD study that I refer to in my column does talk about how COVID has had a dramatic effect across the world in terms of people trusting our public institutions. And I do say again that New Zealand does sit right at the top of, having trust in public institutions and being one of the least corrupt countries in the world. But what it's done also is put a spotlight, I think, on some of the government's activities. And some of them are not necessarily to do with, COVID-19. Some of the other examples that I refer to are, last week there was the Ombudsman's report looking at how official information requests were being handled within departments, quite scathing, particularly about how media requests were being handled, and also a couple of police examples. One being, which was related to COVID, but not necessarily just COVID, was the police putting a false report in so that they could track two women who they alleged had broken the Auckland lockdown. And then there was a story a couple of weeks before that, broken by RNZ, of the police using photos and storing photos that they weren't legally allowed to take or store.
I guess in one sense, though, that report by the Chief Ombudsman Office, doesn't that give us reason, I suppose, to have some trust in institutions, because that is one of our institutions and it is holding to account other government agencies for how they operate under the Official Information Act?
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, the Ombudsman has quite limited powers in this scope. So he's put out quite a scathing report. Now it's up to the Public Service Commission and those individual departments to actually change their behaviour. And what we really saw, particularly from the Public Service Commission, their response was mostly to say that, actually they're doing a pretty good job on official information requests. So it doesn't show that they're going to have a high level response. Similar, around this police action, it's fantastic that our institutions have found these examples out and highlighted how the police have acted inappropriately. But the response from police on both of those was also, well, we think we needed to do it, and also we're probably going to continue doing it.
Slightly not connected to it, but I have to say an irony of the Ombudsman's report, because he specifically criticised the media teams in these government agencies, largely of whom are made up of former journalists.
Yeah, absolutely. So you think they might have a bit more sympathy for it. I mean, I do also think there was some interesting things in the report about sort of timelines and also no surprises going up to ministers' offices. So definitely there's a bit more to be dug into that report. But I do think the point stands that we've had a number of examples over the last few weeks of where this government could be doing more to actually increase trust rather than sort of breaking down some of those bonds we have between government and the rest of the community.
Brigitte Morten, thank you for your time.
Thank you.